In this video, we're going to look at simplifying powers of I. So if you think about simplifying powers of I, an example problem might be simply this. Example, simplify I to the 19th. Well, let's look at what we know. What we've defined is we've defined that I is equal to the square root of minus 1. And that's called the imaginary unit. So if you think about the imaginary unit being I is equal to the square root of minus 1, then we can think about what I squared is. I squared then would be the square root of minus 1 squared. Now, if you think about square roots and squares, those are called inverse operations. So, for example, let's do a simple aside here. If you have the square root of 25 squared, that's just 25. There's two ways to think that. The square root of 25 is 5, and 5 squared is 25. Or you can think about the square root of 25 squared, thinking about the square root and the square are inverse operations. That is, they're opposite operations, so they cancel each other out, and you get 25. Another example here is, let's say you have the square root of 117 squared. Now, 117 squared I can't do in my head. But I know that square and square root are opposite operations or inverse operations, so they cancel out, so this will simply equal to 117. So in that case, we have, let's go back to our original problem here. We have I squared is equal to the square root of negative 1 squared. If the square root and the square root are inverse operations, then they cancel each other out, and you get negative 1. Let's do another one. Let's look at I to the third. If you think about I to the third means I times I times I. Or, if you want to think about it a different way, I squared times I. Now let's think about what I squared is. I squared, we just figured out that I squared is minus 1. So this will equal to minus 1 times I. And if you have minus 1 times I, that's simply negative I. Let's move this up just a little bit. Let's do I to the fourth. I to the fourth, of course, is I times I times I times I. Or, another way to say it, that's I times I is I squared. So that's I squared times I squared. Now what is I squared? I squared, let's look at our previous work. I squared is equal to minus 1, so therefore we have minus 1 times minus 1. Negative times a negative is a positive, and 1 times 1 is 1. So if you notice, we have this very simple pattern. I, of course, is I. I squared is equal to minus 1. I to the third is equal to minus I, and I to the fourth is equal to 1. And we'll repeat this pattern. If you think about I to the fifth is I times I times I times I times I. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 I's. Or another way to say that, probably an easier way to say that, would be I to the third times I squared. I to the third is minus I, and I squared is minus 1. A negative times a negative is a positive, and I times 1 is 1I, or just I. I to the sixth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I to the sixth is I times I times I times I times I times I, right? Or an easier way to say it would be I to the fourth times I squared. But I to the fourth we already know is 1, and I squared is minus 1, so it's 1 times a negative 1, which is this negative 1. I to the seventh, I to the fourth times I to the third. I to the fourth is 1. 1 times I to the third. I to the third is minus I, so it's 1 times minus I, or minus I. In fact, some people actually, what they'll do is they'll memorize this pattern. If you notice, the first 4 is I minus 1 minus I 1. The next one's I minus 1 minus I, and I to the eighth will be 1 again. So if you memorize this pattern, then it's pretty easy to simplify. Let's go back to our original problem, though. Our original problem here was simplify I to the 19th. That one is actually fairly easy if you remember that I squared is minus 1. So let's rewrite this as I squared. So let's think. 2 goes in 18 times. So we can rewrite that as I to the 18th times I. I to the 18th we can rewrite as I squared raised to the power of 9 times I. So the key is to rewrite it in terms of I squared. 19 is 2 times 9 plus 1. If we look at this, I squared, we kind of want to memorize that. So let's write that down and memorize that. I want you to memorize that I squared is minus 1. Whenever I want you to memorize something in notes, I'll just write a little guy with a cowboy hat. That's called memorized guy. And that reminds you need to memorize this. So memorize this. I squared is minus 1. Let's check. I squared is minus 1. So here we have minus 1 raised to the power of 9 times I. Minus 1 raised to the power of 9 will be minus 1 again. So that's minus 1 times I. So I to the 19th is simply minus I. Let's do one more example and then I'll give you a couple to do. Let's simplify I to the 32nd. Now there are faster ways of doing this. If you figure out a faster way of doing this on your own, as long as you get the right answer, that's great. So I to the 32nd, I want to memorize something. Now memorize that I squared is minus 1. Since I squared is equal to minus 1, I'm going to rewrite this as I squared times something. So actually I'm going to rewrite this as I squared raised to the 16th. I squared is minus 1, so I have minus 1 raised to the 16th. If I take minus 1 to the 16th, my answer is 1. So I to the 32 is simply 1. Why don't you do a couple? So here's some examples, and the next video will have answers to these. So let's check and see how those are. Actually, I'll put the answers on this video. I'll just pause it. So let's do some examples. Let's simplify the following. Let's do I to the 29th. Let's do I to the 14th. And let's do I to the 7th. So let's pause this for just a second and you work those out. Let's look at the answer to these problems. I to the 29th is simply I squared to the 14th times I, right? 28. If you want to think about that a little bit slower, it's I to the 28th times I. I squared is minus 1, so that's minus 1 to the 14th times I. Minus 1 to the 14th is just 1, so it's 1 times I, so it's I. I to the 14th, I squared raised to the 7th, minus 1 to the 7th. Minus 1 to the 7th is minus 1. I to the 7th, I squared times 3 times I, right? How did I do that? Let's think about that. That's I to the 7th is equal to I to the 6th times I, or I to the 1, right? And then I to the 6th is I squared raised to the 3rd power. I squared is minus 1. Remember, we've memorized that. So that's minus 1 to the 3rd times I. Minus 1 to the 3rd is going to be negative 1 times I, and your answer is minus I. So if you got all those right, let's go on to the next problem. If not, you need to work some more on powers of complex numbers.